welcome back to this is episode 2 of Casual Conversations, which is my brand new interview show. Today we're chatting with Manfred Sittman of Toronto rock outfit Elephants and Stars. September 1st, you released a new 6-song EP called Get Your Own Army, and I want to jump right into talking about that because I really, really like your EP.
Thank you.
I find it like it kind of brought me back to this like mid 90s, late 90s alternative rock. It was kind of like Killjoysy, it's kind of like Doughboysy, which like when I discovered those bands for the first time like blew my mind because they were so new to me. So I really took to your record, which that's what they reminded me of, and it's also got like a little touch of like the Gin Blossoms, like it's very those pop elements really poke through, but it's like a bit more polished than the Killjoys, so it's like a nice modern take on that sound for me. But who would you say that your band is most influenced by, or that you'd say the sound is more similar to? Because I find that like what I think is always so different from what the artist thinks.
Actually, you're right on the money, because I would say when I first started kind of writing songs in earnest, it was the sort of mid 90s or mid to late 90s, I guess. And the bands I adored, the Doughboys are one of my favorite bands ever. I've seen them, 100 million times. I did love the Killjoys when they were out. We do hear the Gin Blossoms. We get that comparison a lot, which I hear. I think he's got a nicer voice than I do, but I think they're a great band. The other bands, I mean, I guess a lot of it's a bit of a mishmash because, you grow up, your formative years will still have an impact on, I listen to stuff like Kiss and, the kind of regular rock stuff. But I don't think it was until I listened to a lot of punk rock too when I was in high school, like very sort of tunnel vision punk rock, because, you identify so much with it. But I don't think it was until the mid 90s that I really found those bands. And I think a few other ones were like the Lemonheads were big for me. Buffalo Tom was a huge influence. If you go back and listen to like the early soap opera records, which was a band I was in the 90s, it's almost stealing from bands like Buffalo Tom and stuff. So you're actually right in the right zone of all those bands. Lowest of the Low, of course, is an obvious one.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, you have this. You love Lowest of the Low. You're like all up in them.
I do. What's funny is a funny story. Well, not that funny, but an interesting, hopefully, story was I was in bands all through high school. A lot of sort of really awful punk rock bands, but very earnest punk rock bands. And then in sort of towards the end of my high school days, all those bands just went away. Like the Dead Kennedys broke up, and Black Flag broke up, and the Clash broke up, and it was just kind of everything was gone all at once. And I had this sort of weird kind of thing, like, oh, well, like maybe this is all over now. Like maybe now I move on to whatever else I'm going to do. And I saw the Lowest of the Low. A friend of mine said, oh, you should got to come see this band. And I went to see them, and they had that same kind of thing. Like, well, they're not a punk rock band. They're sort of like punk rock adjacent. They have some of the same spirit to them. I had that sort of, you have that aha moment where you're like, oh my God, this is still a thing, and we can be that. And I think I formed a band like a week or two later.
That's awesome. That's actually so cool. I wasn't terribly familiar with Lowest of the Low until I started talking to you over Twitter, and I was like not familiar. Great bands. They helped you work on the EP, did they not?
They did. So I've known a couple of the guys, actually coincidentally through mutual friends outside of music. So I got to know them a little bit. So when we did this, so the prior record we had worked with Ian Blurton, and then so this record we were going to work. We did work with producer Steve Chawley, who we knew from like a million years ago when we were in a band called The First Time, and he was a in-house guy at Metalworks.
That's so funny. And I was going to ask you about Steve. We'll jump back to it. I'll let you finish. But
yeah. And so we did the recording at Palace Sound with him. And then just some scheduling stuff came up, and he's like, I don't think I'm going to be able to mix the record for a while. He's like, I won't be offended if you take it to someone else. And we did kind of want to get moving on it. So I asked Ron, who does a lot of producing and mixing, if he would take it on, and he did. And he turned it around. I thought he did a great job with it. I was really, really pleased with it. Like when he was sending the mixes, for you to critique, usually you send like tons of notes to people. I was just like, oh, this one's fine, or this one maybe just budge this up a little bit.
Keep going.
Yeah. It was the like basically I think that there are 6 songs on there. I think we only requested changes to 2 of the mixes, which is like almost unheard of because,
Yeah. That's
yeah.
awesome though. I feel like that's the way it should be. Like, but you should go into mixing and just like have this, like, generally if you've kind of done your homework about who you're working with, you should have that expectation that like once you hear the first mix back, you should be pretty decently satisfied with what's going on. I feel like if you get the mix from somebody and you're like, wow, this sounds terrible. Like there's
And that's happened. And I won't say with whom, but we've worked in the past in other bands with some pretty big name producers, and they just don't get what you're kind of trying to do. And they're kind of trying to cram you into what they want you to sound like. And I remember we had a conversation once, we got some mixes back, and I sent a bunch of changes requests through, and they came back and it's just like, no, we're not doing this.
brutal.
And I went to our record company at the time and I said, what do I do here? And they're like, you don't get the mixes changed. Like, that's it. So
and it is what it is. See, that would be
it is what it is. And
terrible.
I still have a hard time listening to some of that stuff. But it's funny talking about mixing and doing our homework. We were when we were chatting before, the last 3 days we've been in the studio with Ian Blurton working on what's going to be the next record. And Ian's one of those guys, in addition to having a ton of creative ideas, he sort of mixes as he goes. Like he'll make you sort of sit there for 10 minutes and he'll be like editing tracks and clipping noise and moving stuff around. So by the time I left last night, I mean, granted, he hasn't started mixing it yet, but I think those are probably 80% of what it's going to sound like, maybe 90, like just hearing the board mixes.
I love that. I feel like that's also, at least, I mean, there's obviously different production styles. There's all sorts of different ways you can tackle any record, but I kind of feel like from me and my experience, that's kind of the way it should be. Like ultimately, you should be pretty happy with what's happening when you're in studio recording. And if you're happy with that, everything else should just kind of flow a little nicer. If you're trying to like polish up a really, really bad recording later, you're going to have a terrible time.
Yeah, and it's a really unsettling feeling when you leave a studio and you're having the conversation like, well, I hope they can fix that in the mix, or I hope they can do that in the mix, because usually they can't. Like if it's not there, like I believe you're a lot more savvy technically in terms of mixing and recording stuff. Like I've only ever done it as a participant. I don't know much about Logic or Pro Tools and stuff. So when people, a lot of times I think I ask really dumb questions in the studio because I don't know what's possible and what's not. And I'll say like, oh, well, can we do something like this? And they'll be like, yeah, that's 2 seconds. Or no, that, sound doesn't work that way. So, I'm not afraid to ask dumb questions. So
you should be totally comfortable like asking any questions. I feel in any recording studio space. I think as soon as you're in a situation where you're in a session and you feel like it's not your place, especially as the artist, that is it's your work to be like, oh, I'm gonna make a comment about this part, this piece, this whatever. If you're hesitating, I think you're working with the wrong people. Like
100%.
Right off the jump. And it doesn't matter how many Grammys you have, how many Junos you have, you are setting a bad tone for the session. And it's gonna, for me, I feel like it's always gonna come through the record. Not everybody agrees with that. But I feel like that kind of thing comes through.
I think you're right, and it's funny because I also agree with your point about it doesn't really matter how great your credentials are or your track record. Not every producer's right for every band. Like I know a friend of mine's band, their first record. I don't want to say their name because I'm going to say something about their producer.
Fair enough.
But they don't like the sound of the record. They're really, really unhappy with it. And I love the sound of their record. Like it's really, I see why they don't like it. It's very murky and it's very kind of, there's not a lot of dynamics to it, but it has this sound to it. And I said to them, I'm like, yeah, you could have really polished it up and made it great. But I said, one of your favorite records is Murmur by REM. Like, do you think that would have sounded great if Bob Rock produced it? Like, no, it'd be a whole different record. I love the sound that they got. But just to sort of piggyback on the point you made about being in the studio and being feeling free to have ideas. We were working on a song last night, and we had 3 really long days, and I think it was like getting toward like 11:30 last night. We're all a little punch drunk, and Ian, who's always like a million, he's like an explosion of creative ideas. He's always like, "What if we did this? What if we did this?" and you kind of have to be on your toes because sometimes he'll just be like, what if you played what he's playing, but play it backwards and a scale off? And you have to kind of like learn on the fly. And I'm not super good at that. I'm not like a real great improver. I'm super showed up. But he was like one thing after another. And then I started suggesting stuff, thinking he was just going to shoot it down. And we were almost, I don't want to say we were getting silly, but like literally nothing got shot down last night. And we put every idea we had into this one song. And we listened to it back and we were laughing because there's so much stuff crammed in. We think probably something's going to have to come out. But at midnight last night, we were laughing our heads off because we had like explosion sound effects and this sound effect and like all this stuff, and like we were layering guitars on top of keyboards on top of this and
making a movie.
Synthesizer loops, and we were doing vocal samples and all stuff that doesn't really go in our stuff. But like I said, at midnight last night, we were really enamored of it.
It's cool because like sometimes those moments can bring you to a place that you wouldn't have got to otherwise unless you took that time to be like, let's get a little ridiculous for the next hour and just cram it all in there. And if you have the ability to do so like we do now with multi-track recording the way we can, it's like, sure, spend the time. What's an hour gonna save you? If you're on a strict budget and strict timeline, you don't really have that same play.
Yeah.
But yeah, like sometimes those are exactly the moments that you're like, yeah, we would have never came up with the synth part. You may get rid of 10 other tracks in the process, but you still kept that synth part, and you wouldn't have got there without that 45 minutes of whatever.
Yeah, that's silliness. But and there's definitely some of that stuff for sure going to stay. I just don't know that we're going to keep all of it, because when I tell you, like, it's almost comical how much stuff got popped. It's like that Saturday Night Live skit where the guy's eating the taco and then they keep wrapping it in like something else and something else. It's like we did the musical version of that last night.
Totally.
Yeah.
I find it funny because like I've been in like a lot of recording sessions where, you know, working with certain producers that are the type of producers that are, every song is 200 tracks, 250 tracks, an absurd amount of overdubs, absurd amount of tracking. And I get it for certain styles. It makes sense, I guess. But I find like myself when I'm recording my own stuff, like I get to, you know, maybe 50 tracks if I'm being ridiculous, but I'm doing stuff at home. And then I'm like, all right, it's time to dial back here. Like, we don't need so much stuff. I think there's this like a kind of an obsession with front loading tracks now and layering. Sometimes it's very, very cool. I totally understand it. But I always wonder, like, there's like a whole new generation of producers that they only know to have 250 tracks a song. I'm like, have you guys tried one with 20? Have you seen what that's like?
Yeah, I mean, the Beatles were doing 4 tracks and bouncing stuff around, and they figured it out. So I think a lot of it too comes down to how confident you are in your material. Like I find when I'm 100% sure that I like a song, I'm more content to just like, you know, one guitar track, one lead track, whenever, and just kind of let it be. And I think maybe the ones that you're like, I'm not sure if this one's going to be great. What if we put 800 different rhythm guitars and just made it sound huge or whatever? So I think that sometimes plays into it. Like you're maybe not 100% sure, and you just kind of maybe, again, like fixing it in the mix, you're fixing it by multi-tracking it. I mean, I'm sure it's different for everyone, but I know that in the past when I've done that, it's because you're never like, this is a great song, I'm going to put 50 rhythm tracks on here.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's like, yeah, it's almost like you're trying to hide stuff, and it's like a
weird...
Yeah,
exactly.
Like just let it breathe, let it sit there, let that part. It might be a very simple part. Maybe that's what you think, yeah, why it needs more, but maybe it needs a simple part. Like that's okay. Like I remember like when I was like learning how to play bass, and I'm playing Beatles songs. I'm like, it's like 3 notes, and I'm like, this is still slays today, people. 3 notes. That's all they're doing.
100%. And I mean, so much of my favorite music is not particularly complex or even like dense. Like if you go back, I mean, some of the Doughboys records are pretty heavily tracked, but you know, you go back to some of those mid-90s tracks, like some of the early Buffalo Tom stuff, it sounds like they did it on a 4-track, but the songs are great, you know. And then they got some pretty high-end producers later on, and sort of you could really hear their sound change. But their early stuff to me is as good as their later stuff. It's just different. Dinosaur Jr. too.
Yeah, it's just a different style for sure. Yeah, I think it's good to experiment with everything and then find what, like, you eventually always hone in on what you really like, and then you have a much better idea the next time you go into it.
Yeah, the other thing, just to sort of like put a bow on that, is one of the things that Ian working with Ian has taught me is to be really concise in the writing and not to be super self-indulgent. Like, if you look at the first record that Elephants and Stars did, like we have like a 5.5 minute song, a 5 minute song, 4.5 minute song. Like that stuff just won't fly with him. He's like, take this out, take this out, take this out. He's like, he goes, make your choruses great. He goes, make your verses as good as the choruses. He goes, tie it together after you have. He goes, in at 3.5 minutes, start cutting. That's his rule for us. Which is funny because he puts out like songs that are like 12 minutes long, but his rule for us
what's
is
that all
3.5.
about? Like, why is this okay for you? What's wrong with us?
Yeah, well, it's funny because Mike, our bass player, he likes to play with his fingers as opposed to a pick. And Ian's like, listen, whenever you're in the studio, only a pick, always a pick. I want to hear that. And we went to go see his band, Ian's band, and his bass player was playing with fingers. And Mike's like, hey, what's the deal?
Yeah.
So I guess it's just the rules he has for us, but it's fine. It works. It works for us.
Yeah, no, as long as you guys are happy with it and everything's gelling nicely. But that's really funny because like I find even like when I'm tracking, like I love finger playing bass. It sounds better to me on record. Like even in the punkiest of songs, I often find it coats differently. I don't know.
It does, like, and I think it takes out some of the noise too.
Yeah.
So I again, I don't know like what his vision is, but I'm sort of content to not rock the boat on things like that. That's not one of the hills I'll die on. I'm like, yeah, you want me to use a pick, I'll use a pick. You want me to use this guitar instead of that guitar, fine.
Yeah. We all hear things differently, I think, is a big part that we all forget. It's like if I'm listening to like the latest Foo Fighters record, like I'm going to hear that record differently than even you will hear it, even if we like a lot of the same bands, because it's
100%.
Yeah.
Because we're all sort of, the walking sum total of everything we listen to. Like, so I know that you're a fan of Death Cab, and it's not that I'm not a fan, but they're just not someone I've listened to a tremendous amount. Like I know some of their stuff and I like it,
we'll have to change that.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I sent the new record to a friend of mine and they were talking about the song, How Can It Be? And they said, this sounds like Death Cab. And I said, that's not possible because I don't listen to Death Cab. And they said, go listen to the verse of your song and go listen to the verse of I Will Follow You in the Dark. He said, they're like, it's so similar. And I went and listened to it. I was like, yeah, it is.
That's funny.
Melody is not quite legally actionable, but it's definitely, I think anyone who heard that song would probably go, like, oh, he likes that song, which I do, by the way. But it was just kind of a happy accident.
That's funny. That's I like what I like about Death Cab is like they definitely honed in on like a very unique style that is true to Death Cab. Like it's felt across all their records, and beyond that, I find it's felt when I listen to other bands, and I'm like, oh, that's a very Ben Gibbard bass line right there. That's a very it's a very something they would have done.
Yeah.
And I think that's like what attracts me to that band and to certain other bands where I'm like, wow, they really managed to hone in on a sound that's uniquely their own.
Which is really particularly interesting for them because as I've sort of recently started listening to them more, is they do have that sound, but they are able to go and have these sort of quieter songs and then these kind of like more, well, not Rashas, but like songs like No Sunlight, which is a more upbeat song, or Crooked Teeth or whatever, and still maintain their sound through the whole thing. Jimmy World's good at that too. Yeah, I think part of it is
they're great for that. Yeah,
both of them have very unique emotive voices, which I think helps kind of glue it all together. But yeah, like they both have that ability to sort of like push either edge of whatever their sound is, whether it's heavier or lighter, which I think what makes them both such great bands.
Yeah, they definitely are able to skirt genres in such a way, which I really like because it's I think it's something all of us think about too. It's you don't want to be put into one box necessarily because like we all have so many of our own influences. So of course you want to be able to branch out, and you don't want to just be labeled just just a hair metal band or just a punk band or whatever.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the bands that I have liked, in my sort of adult years do that. Like, I mean, Sloan does it because they have, the 4 different writers, and Blue Rodeo has gone from like, they have some real rock and roll stuff to some real country-ish stuff or whatever you call it, like Canadiana, to everything in between, and they can play rock songs and they can play ballads and they can they have those two distinct voices in there, and I think that's what has made them interesting for so long to so many people.
I think so too. I think that's like the key to longevity as a unique artist with original sounds. If you're not an artist that's just trying to play covers or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's like an important thing. I wanted to ask you, what's it like working with Steve as a producer? Because I worked with Steve very briefly, one session years and years, like 12, 13 years ago, I'm talking.
Mm-hmm.
And it just happened that I was working with another producer and we went to the studio he was the house engineer at. So I happened to work with him in that way. Nicest guy. I haven't seen him in forever, but I remember
Literally the nicest man you could meet on the earth, like to the point where, and this probably speaks more poorly of me than it does of Steve. When I first met Steve, he's so nice that you almost think he's playing you, like that he's kind of having you on. Like, I guess I'm suspicious of people, but I've met two people in my life. Mike Pinball Clemens is the other one, where they're so nice and they're so genuine. You're like, you're putting me on, right? Like this,
yeah,
you're not really like this, but
this is
he
a
is.
joke.
He is that nice. He's the nicest, most decent human being ever. We had a really good time working with him. Because he's so different than the other producers we work with. I mean, and every producer's super different, but I mean, Ian is very much a taskmaster. He's got his ideas ready to go. He's a perfectionist. He will tell you, like, if a track is no good, he will tell you that's terrible. Do it again. That's awful. Do it again. Where Steve, again, partially because of his niceness and partially because of approach, it was a very laid back few days. We were at Palace Sound, which he works out of a lot now, and yeah, we would just sort of like kind of breeze in, kick a few ideas around. He was more interested in getting good takes, making sure everything was in tune. Not a particularly heavy-handed producer. We've worked with the extreme heavy-handed pipes, and he is the exact opposite of that. So it was a really nice change up for us to sort of come in and just sort of be able to do whatever we want. I wouldn't say we co-produced it. I don't think that's accurate, but it was very a collaborative sort of, like he was just sort of like the fifth member of the band for a while, and we were just kind of kicking ideas around. So it was really nice. I would have liked to have given him the chance to mix it. So, maybe someday in the future.
Yeah, no, that's awesome for sure. That's exactly how I kind of imagine he would be as a producer, and I think he's like that. I'm just saying this. I barely know the guy,
Yeah.
but just from like my experience, when you're working in recording studios as a staff engineer on some level, and you're doing it for so many years, as Steve has also done in different studios, I think you just kind of, as an engineer, you get used to taking that back seat and you don't want to step on people's toes because you're like, I'm here to help you. I'm here to help you do the best job you can do today. And other producers are maybe like, okay, I'm here to push you to do the best job I think you can do today. And there's that distinction, and it just comes with, I think, depending on the kind of people you've had to work with in the past, because sometimes people don't like your opinions. Some bands are very like hands-on. They're like, I'm producing this record, you're just getting those sounds for me.
That's a really interesting theory. And I would, as I was listening to you explain it, I thought that's probably exactly right, because he was the house guy, especially at Metalworks when, it's a lot of big bands record that, which means a lot of big producers. And when we were recording at Metalworks, when he was our engineer, our producer was Warren Livesey, who, he's well known for doing like Beds Are Burning by Midnight Oil and and, all the Matthew Good records. So again, Warren was definitely more, not a taskmaster, but more of like that traditional, what you were describing a producer to be. And Steve was just kind of, making sure all the levels were right and making sure this was recorded right and the mic was in the right position. And I think you're right. I think that's kind of just the tact he's taken as a producer. And instead of collaborating with the producer, he collaborates with the band. And
Yeah,
it's that same vibe. But yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that's probably exactly right.
I think it's cool because it allows for like a very relaxed feeling in the session. Like I've always said, it's like it's very important to have that more relaxed feel, so that's when you're going to get the best performance out of everybody. Because even again, necessarily if you're working with a super 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 great producer that you're really excited to work with, but if they're behaving in such a way, or they're being a bit more aggressive, like it starts to bum you out. You're like, we're here to have a good time. We're not here to like, you know.
Yeah, speaking of the low, there's a story, I think I can tell it because I think it's public knowledge. When they did their second record, they brought in a really well-known producer called Don Smith, who had worked with the Rolling Stones and Cracker and everyone, and they were super psyched to be working with him. And then he turned out to be this horrendous racist.
Oh,
And they, if you know anything about those guys, that's not going to fly. And Ron was on the phone to his manager saying, like, not only do I not want this guy to produce our record, like I actively want to punch this guy's lights out.
yeah.
And they're like, yeah, well, we've already paid him like whatever the dollar figure was, 50 grand or some insane early 90s type monetary figure. So they went through the sessions, and I know that those guys, they have a hard time listening to that record because of that experience in the studio where you get your dream producer and then he's like horrible.
Oh, yeah, that sounds like a nightmare. That
Yeah.
sounds like the worst time ever.
I've heard, I have another, again, I don't know, another kind of well-known musician that I spoke to once. They got to hire their dream producer and he was so bad they had to fire him.
That's
And
the thing too. Like you don't always know what you're getting. It's like, yeah, they might have a certain credit to their name. Maybe that record even sold really well or won an award or something, but you don't really know the extent of their helping in that and just what that is really like, because I mean some of them don't like you to talk about it. And then
yeah, well, you're hearing all this stuff now. Like for years, Rick Rubin was like this untouchable figure of like he's the gold standard of all producers. And now all these things are coming out where people are like, oh, he doesn't do anything, and he's just the engineers do all the work. And I'm like, wow, what, like, when did that happen?
it's so weird because I feel like with the Rick Rubin stuff, I feel like they're glorifying that part of it. Like they're making that seem like, no, yeah, that's totally normal and appropriate. And I'm not saying it's inappropriate or that it's not a good thing to have somebody like Rick Rubin in a session. He seems interesting from what I've seen with these recent interviews and these recent quotes and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, it's like, really, what are you doing? What are you doing in there? Like I think about when I used to work the odd like hip hop and rap sessions, and those are very different from rock sessions. And the biggest distinction is that hip hop and rap artists tend to bring in a slew of people that have nothing to do with the record that are hanging out in the studio, and you're just like, what are you all doing here? Like why are you even here? Like you're not assisting, you're not helping, they don't even really want you to say anything. You're just taking up space.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't find that's usually the case in rock music. So it's funny when all this Rick Rubin stuff came out and you're just like, so what's Rick doing there? How did he how did he
Yeah, it's so weird because it was so extreme because he went from being so revered to so, well, I don't want to say vilified, but like everything, like he's gone from like genius to did nothing. Like
Yeah.
there was no stop in the middle where some people were saying he was good. It was just such a free fall.
It's strange because I feel like in the music industry there's always this part of all of us where it's like you might be friends with somebody or you really like hanging out with them and they're a lot of fun to be around, so you're like, yeah, come hang out in the studio, and then it turns into this thing where you're like, oh, now they're working for me, which is just like you gave them a title. And
Yeah.
part of me wonders, like, is that what happened with Rick? Like, did somebody just be like, yeah, you're producing, and he ran with it, and
Yeah.
now he's a huge deal. Like, it's, I don't know, how did it happen?
Yeah, and the funny thing is I don't think it takes much to get to that point because really the music industry and artists being what it's like, if you get one hit to your name, everyone just wants to be associated with your name.
Yeah,
So they probably half of them don't even care if you do anything. They just want to slap produced by Rick Rubin back when
yeah,
back when
it's
there was CDs.
a big pile on. Yeah,
Yeah, they want to, and then their bio, they can write about Rick Rubin, and that'll probably get them some press. And our artists are always looking for any way to get to worm their way into something that they're not in yet.
yeah.
So I could see, and again, if you're Rick Rubin and you can charge stupid money to people to just have your name and you can come show up for a while, like more power to you.
Sweet gig. Yeah, no, for sure. I totally agree. On that note, we only have like a few minutes left, but I want to kind of touch on it's sort of on that note anyway. When it comes to like record labels, because I find that's almost a similar conversation where it's like, especially now in 2023, you've been on record label or multiple record labels. So, and you've been on record labels, you know, a few years back when things were quite a bit differently, like before really the whole everything changed with streaming and all this. Um,
Mm.
so you've seen the shift, I think, like in the culture of record labels. Um, do like what benefit do you see these days to being on a record label? Do you see it as more of like kind of like that pile on, like I just want to be associated with this name, or do what benefit is there for
Well,
you?
it's definitely not like it used to be, where they're shelling out big dollars for an artist. I mean, unless you're like, you know, a Taylor Swift, where you were just like a commodity that they're investing in. You know, the days of like Jet getting, you know, this $4 million contract before they put out a record, like that's over, I think. I think depending on who you are, there are advantages still to being associated with a major label, because like anything, it's a relationship business, right? It's who you know and who your quote unquote people know. Um, I watched an interview with the Beaches on the show that Young Gomeshi used to host. I can't remember the name of it.
Oh, Q or
Uh,
whatever.
yeah, they were on there, and they were because they just got dropped from the major label,
Oh, did
and
they?
yeah, which is insane to me.
Shows you how much I'm paying attention to Canadian music.
Yeah, well, so but you know, I think that being on a major label was instrumental to them getting to where they are now, because you know, when you are on a major label, well, now you can, it's so easy to get a manager and it's so easy to get a booking agent, because the label can call and get that for you. Like if I cold call, you know, whatever the Pecan agency, they're going to be like, yeah, we don't know who you are. That, you
Yeah.
know, call back in a month. But if, you know, Universal Records calls, they're like, great, how many dates do you want? Who do you want to be with? So I think that's where an artist, particularly like a lower tier artist, for lack of a better term, could really benefit. It's from those relationships, you know, being able to not only have a little bit of money put into you, but you know, you will get, you know, there are magazines that will review your record if you're on Universal, but if you send it to them as an independent artist, they don't care, you
Yeah.
know. But those industry contacts are probably the most valuable, particularly like booking agents and managers, because then now you've got, not only you've got these people on your side, but these people's people are now on your side, and they kind of become your people, and then now their relationships are open to you. And you know, that's how a lot of tours get booked, because you know, these two bands are with the same agency. Like, let's say I get picked up by Universal, well, us, me, whatever, and Jimmy World's on Universal. Well, hey, guess what? Jimmy World's going on tour, and we're trying to break this new young band. We're going to send them out with Jimmy World. I mean,
Yeah.
it's those relationships that I think are really invaluable, and still will always be.
I think that's true too. I think I don't understand where this like weird discourse about like you don't need a record label, you don't need a booking agent, you don't need all these people, and I'm like, I don't know how long any of those people have spent trying to book gigs or trying to get interviews or trying to get
You
virtually any attention on their music, because I've been there, I've been doing it, and I'm like, they don't care. No one
Yeah,
cares.
no, you absolutely need those people. If you're just doing it for the sake of doing it, which kind of that's where we are now. Like we're a little bit older and we've kind of been around, and we don't really have designs on that level of success. But if you're a younger artist or trying to become an established artist, you absolutely need those people and you need those relationships. That's how you literally build a career. So yeah, so I don't understand that discourse either. I understand to the point, like if you're like us and you want to put out a record, well, now you can do it and you don't need a major label, because you don't need to pay the physical cost of printing 1,000 CDs or 1,000 vinyls, or, you know, paying $50,000 for a producer. Like you can, you know, go to a small studio on your own, pay the engineer, get it mixed, and you can have it up on Spotify the next day. Or someone like yourself who's technical, you could probably record it yourself, have it on Spotify the next day, and yeah, it's out. I mean,
Yeah,
is it without promotion and any kind of machinations behind it, is it going to be successful? Probably not. I
exactly.
mean, I don't know how many artists are sending stuff to the Spotify, put me on the list. You know, when you submit to that and you have to pitch them on a song, and
Yeah.
I mean, they must be getting a million of those a day. I know from speaking with, there was one manager we were talking to, and he said that, he doesn't even think they listen to half of that stuff. But because he manages a couple of bigger artists, he literally goes into the Spotify offices and pitches them on listen stuff. And again, that's where we were talking about. It's those relationships that actually get you to that level. I mean, you can have a great song, but if no one's listening to it, what does it matter?
Yeah, I think that's really important for a lot of artists to wrap their head around and just understand that it is what it is. Like you have to do that. We're literally about to run out of time, which is crazy because we could obviously, I feel like we could talk for a long time.
Oh my God, for sure.
I want to give you a quick minute if there's anything quickly you want to plug for anybody to check out. Obviously, we want them to hear the EP, but is there anything else you want to mention before we sign off here?
No, we'll go with that. Thanks for having me on. If anybody listening wants to go listen to the EP, I'd be happy for them to do so.
Awesome. I will put together a blog post for you, so we'll post that later with this episode. And thank you very much for your time. I really, really appreciate you making the time for me today. And
no problem.
Hopefully we can reconvene sooner rather than later and chat some more about this stuff.
That would be great. And thanks for having me on, and good to finally meet you.
Likewise. All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.